Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, formed a cabinet, and many of his cabinet members were former rivals for the presidency. During his time in office, Lincoln struggled with the issue of slavery. Initially, Lincoln did not come out in favor of freeing all the slaves. By 1862, however, Lincoln was edging toward emancipating all the slaves in the South. In July of 1862, Abraham Lincoln spoke with two of his cabinet secretaries, William Seward, who was Secretary of State, and Gideon Welles, who was Secretary of the Navy. Lincoln read to them a document about emancipation. Neither Seward nor Welles at the time came out in support of it. A few days later, Lincoln spoke to his entire cabinet about emancipation of the slaves. The reaction among the cabinet was mixed. Secretary of State William Seward told Lincoln not to issue an emancipation proclamation at that time because, Seward said, it would seem an act of desperation. Seward advised Lincoln to wait until the North had won an important military victory. One member of the cabinet, Postmaster General, told Lincoln that the Emancipation Proclamation might hurt Lincoln in the 1862 election. The other members of the cabinet, however, for the most part, supported Lincoln's efforts of emancipation. In September of 1862, Abraham Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This document stated that if areas that were still in rebellion against the North by January of 1863 would have all their slaves freed. Now, Lincoln consulted with members of his cabinet about the wording of the Emancipation Proclamation, but not actually the substance. In other words, Lincoln had arrived at the goal of emancipation, and he was asking his cabinet members not what they thought, but for their input on the actual wording of the Emancipation Proclamation. The final Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863, and it did have the full support of the members of his cabinet because Lincoln was able to work with them effectively so that all of his cabinet, even though some of whom were not really Lincoln supporters, did support his goal of freeing all the slaves. Okay, questions? I am the Postmaster General, I'm forgetting his name, Montgomery Blair, thank you. And I forgot to include that name in there, I blanked out, thank you very much, yes. Montgomery Blair told Lincoln, I'm really not sure about this. But anything else you want in there?
Why did Lincoln need people to help him make decisions about, like, why did he really need a cabinet?
Okay, every president has to have a cabinet. That is, there are government agencies, like a War Department or a State Department that runs foreign policy. So a president has to appoint members to the cabinet. Lincoln appointed members to his cabinet who were for the most part Republicans, but had been rivals of Lincoln. And yet Lincoln was able, because he was such a patient person, to work with all of these people. So a president does have to have advisors, because a president can't run the entire government himself. That's why he has to have a cabinet.
Did you have any other questions? Was there any one of the cabinet members in particular who would have been more vocal than the next, either for or against?
Yes. Do you want to get this on?
If you'll just
Yeah.
kind of restate
Yeah.
it.
Lincoln's cabinet was a diverse group. He had an Attorney General, Edwin Bates, who was conservative, who actually opposed emancipation, or at least equality, for African Americans. But he had what were known as radical Republicans in his cabinet. For example, his Secretary of the Treasury was Salmon Chase. Chase was an extremely ambitious man who had wanted to be president in 1860 and never really fully accepted Lincoln as president. Chase was a radical Republican who wanted emancipation and fully supported Lincoln's goal of freeing all the slaves, even at the same time when he didn't fully support Lincoln's other policies. Other members of the cabinet, Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edmund Stanton, who was in fact a Democrat, saw the Emancipation Proclamation as primarily a document about the war effort, and he gave it his full support because Stanton believed that the Emancipation Proclamation would help the Union in the war to defeat the Confederacy.
Anything else, George, you have a specific question about?
I have one more.
Yes,
Do they have a certain meeting place or a certain time they actually had the meetings?
very good. Lincoln generally would convene a cabinet meeting every Tuesday and Friday afternoon. He didn't have to, but that's generally when we would do it. However, and this is important, Lincoln preferred to meet with cabinet secretaries by himself. He would prefer to call his Secretary of State or his Secretary of War in so he could meet with them individually.
Okay, do you want to go on to yours? Yes. No, it's okay. It's not going to rain for a few seconds, so.
Okay.
I have a quick question
Yes.
about theirs.
Yes.
Was Stephen Douglas in the cabinet?
No. Stephen Douglas died, was a senator from Illinois. He was never a part of the cabinet. He died, however, in, I believe, July of 1861. He died just a couple of months after the Civil War started. He was a Democrat who had campaigned for the presidency against Abraham Lincoln in 1860, but however, he supported the war, but he wasn't a member of the cabinet.
Okay, you want to go on to the sixth debate? Do you have anything else, girls, that you need clarifying? Okay, we'll go on to the sixth debate. If you want to tell us something about the sixth debate.
Sure.
Okay, you ready? You're quiet.
Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas held 7 debates in the 1858 senatorial election. These debates are now very famous because they made a name for Abraham Lincoln and they launched his path to the presidency. However, in 1858, Stephen Douglas was by far the more famous man. Stephen Douglas was the incumbent senator and Abraham Lincoln was challenging him for the Senate seat. Lincoln issued a challenge to Douglas to debate, which Douglas reluctantly accepted. Lincoln and Douglas would debate in 7 places in Illinois during the 1858 contest. The 6th debate was held in October 1858 in the city of Quincy, Illinois. It was held on a Wednesday afternoon. Like all these debates, the debate in Quincy lasted several hours, with Douglas speaking for about an hour and a half and Lincoln speaking for about an hour and a half. This debate, the 6th debate between Lincoln and Douglas, has been called by some historians the most contentious of all the debates. The 2 men very furiously argued during this debate. Like all the debates, the main question was about slavery. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, opposed the extension of slavery. Stephen Douglas, a Democrat, supported a concept known as popular sovereignty, whereby the people in a territory would determine if the territory, when it became a state, would have slavery. During the 6th debate, Abraham Lincoln attacked Douglas, and he called upon Douglas to say whether or not he believed slavery was moral or immoral.
Wait, let's stop for just a second. Let her
Oh, sure.
She's got a terrible cough.
Oh, believe me, I understand. Yes.
I'm sorry.
No, I have not stopped coughing in 3 weeks. It's awful.
That's what she said. She's been coughing all day. She's going to stay out there, I think.
Okay.
Okay, we'll pick up where you left off.
All right, during the debate, Lincoln challenged Douglas to say whether or not slavery was moral or immoral. Douglas simply avoided the question. Lincoln criticized the Dred Scott decision because Lincoln claimed that the Dred Scott decision of 1857 might mean there would be slavery everywhere in the country. Stephen Douglas criticized Abraham Lincoln. Douglas claimed that Lincoln would tell one audience one thing about slavery, and when they moved to a different part of the state, Lincoln would say something else. This was a very heated debate. And we believe that about 12,000 people attended this debate. All these debates drew people from miles and miles around who stood and listened to these two men debate for over 3 hours. The sixth debate did not, like all the debates, settle any of the questions. But as time went on, the debates attracted more and more attention and drew more and more attention to Abraham Lincoln's views. Now, eventually, Stephen Douglas would win the election and would be reelected back to the Senate. But the importance of the debates was that the debates made Abraham Lincoln a national figure and would catapult him to the presidency. And today, the Qunicy debate is remembered as a very famous debate, the sixth debate that took place between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas.
Do you have any questions, please?
Hold on. When they were getting ready for this debate,
Yes.
how did the people react?
What do you mean, like?
Like when they like pass out flyers and everything to let people know, and then when they did, when they're like a bunch of people like talking about it, like just.
Oh, yes. The debates attracted enormous amounts of attention. People traveled by railroad to come. People traveled up and down the Mississippi River. People rode by horseback. Both the Republican and Democratic parties told the people to come out. These debates were significant because they were events. People came from hundreds of miles away to attend them. People dressed in their best. People cheered when Douglas appeared on stage, when Lincoln appeared on the railroad train. So people were very, very excited all throughout to see them. And 12,000 people is a huge amount of people. 12,000 people in 1858 is an enormous amount. Remember, this is at a time when people can't travel by car. They can't fly. So getting that, and Quincy didn't have a very big population, so people were very excited about this. Remember, this is a Wednesday. You know, it's not, you know, people took off work. Or people, remember, where most people worked, they worked on farms. They gave up farm work for a day to come see the debates.
If you had to say that the sixth debate was different than any of the other debates,
Yes.
what would that be?
The sixth debate is most famous for really almost the personal attacks that Lincoln and Douglas took upon each other. Lincoln's advisors told Lincoln that he had been too defensive in the first 5 debates and they had to go on the offensive in the sixth debate. So in the sixth debate, Lincoln really criticized Douglas for not saying whether or not slavery was moral or immoral. Lincoln really criticized Douglas for the Dred Scott, the Supreme Court Dred Scott decision of 1857, which Lincoln claimed could allow slavery to go everywhere. Douglas didn't take to the attacks lying down. He went after Abraham Lincoln. So that is why many historians say that these debates are different in the tone, in that these two men really attacked each other.
Was there any admission?
No, it was free. No, it was free. The debate itself took place in what is now Washington Park, but what was back then called John Square.
I think that's good. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I saw a segment in there that would be fabulous for what we're doing.
It was called John Square because John Quincy Adams. Yes.